We should say that Anna Veciana-Suarez is with us, and we're very pleased. So welcome, Anna, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Karen.
We can go over some housekeeping rules, Stephanie, yeah?
Yes, we can. So I put some suggestions in the chat. If everybody could just open the chat. It would be best to view this in speaker view, and that is the default setting. You don't need to do anything. But if you're somehow in gallery view and want to switch to speaker view, all you have to do is click on it. Speaker view makes this one person who's speaking predominant on your screen. So you're not looking at 200 or 500 faces. You'll all be muted throughout the presentation, and you can't unmute yourselves. It's set so that you can't. That way we don't get all the background noise. If you have questions, there's going to be questions and answers afterwards. We'd like you to write your questions in the chat. Make sure that it goes to either me, Stephanie Owitz, or to everyone. It doesn't matter. If it goes to everyone, I will be copying and pasting and sending to the moderator select questions. We may not get to all the questions, so please don't be offended if you write a question and we don't get to it. But that will be up to Anna and Lori how many questions they're going to take, but I'll forward them to Anna. So those are basically the housekeeping rules. We're delighted to have you all here, and we thank you. We have on the shared screen right now the current presentation and the next two save the dates. At the end, I will also post the save the dates for the next two events. So we look forward to seeing you. If you haven't registered yet for the other two, you must register because there's limited space. So you have to register through your JCC, the appropriate link. That's all I have to say. Anybody else want to add anything from our other JCCs?
I'll just say that this has been a pleasure. This is a first for our collaboration of our South Florida and Orlando JCCs working together. We often work very closely throughout the year over the years, but this is our first effort to have an event all together, which is possible because we're doing it virtually. So as we all have been saying over these last months, there are silver linings to all of this. And I think this is a great example of a silver lining that we can, work together as a larger community and come together from all parts of Florida and probably people from, elsewhere in the country. So it's really been a pleasure to put this together.
Hello, Lori.
Gottlieb. Wonderful. Welcome.
20 minutes, just so you guys know. You guys have been talking this whole time. And
we couldn't find you. Was it, maybe it was named something else.
Here, I don't know. But anyway, hello.
Hello and welcome.
Hello, welcome.
I heard you guys, you kept saying the speaker's not here. I'm like, I'm here.
Okay.
The fun and joys of Zoom, as we've all been experiencing.
Okay, so then Anna and Lori, you can begin whenever you'd like.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome. It's kind of a momentous day because it's the first time we're all doing this from different J's. I'm Anna Veciana-Suarez. I'm a syndicated columnist and author of several nonfiction and fiction books. And I have been a longtime member of the Alpert JCC. So I'm really excited because I've done this usually just for the Alpert JCC with a limited audience. Now we're doing across South Florida and Orlando. So this is the first program which is part of the Summer Author Series at the J. And 6 Florida JCCs are participating. This includes the Alpert JCC, the Galbert Family JCC, the Adolph and Rose Levi's JCC in Boca, the David Posnick in Fort Lauderdale, the Roth JCC in Orlando, and the Michael N. Russell in North Miami. So before we welcome Lori back in, I just want to say that just a little bit about the format. Hopefully we'll talk for about 30 minutes and then open it up to questions. As Stephanie said, please type in your questions to the chat room and I will be sent the questions, and we'll try to get as many as we can. So finally, I have the great honor to welcome Lori Gottlieb, a very funny and wise woman. Lori is a psychotherapist and author of the New York Times bestseller, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. You don't have this here. And the book is being adapted as a television series, by the way. She also writes the Atlantic Weekly Dear Therapist advice column and contributes regularly to the New York Times and many other publications. Her recent TED Talk is one of the top 10 most watched of the year, which is quite an accomplishment. She's also a member of the Advisory Council for Bring Change to Mind and an advisor to the Aspen Institute. And you probably are also familiar when you see her appearing on the Today Show, Good Morning America, the CBS This Morning, CNN, and NPR's Fresh Air. She also is working on a new iHeart Radio podcast called Dear Therapist, which is being produced by Katie Couric. So Lori, a warm Florida welcome. Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, I've got to tell you, I really laughed out loud at some of the scenes in the book, which I was really surprised. I thought it was going to be a really heavy book, but it was just very funny in place. So, and also very poignant and very insightful. Tell us briefly how you came about to writing this book, why you did it, because it's also a very personal book about your roundabout way of becoming a therapist.
Yeah. So in the book, as you know, I follow 4 very seemingly different patients. And then there's a 5th patient in the book, who is me, as I go to therapy, as I'm going through something in my own life. So you see kind of the human condition from both sides, from the clinician's perspective and from the patient's perspective. And you know, this wasn't the idea that I originally had to write about. It came about, and I write in the book about how it came about too, as sort of like a meta version of how the book came to exist. I originally had written a piece for the Atlantic called How to Land Your Kid in Therapy, Why Our Obsession with Our Kids' Happiness Might Be Dooming Them to Unhappy Adulthoods. And that piece spread like wildfire. It went viral, and publishers wanted me to write that book. And I did not want to write a helicopter parenting book. I felt like there was something else that I wanted to say. And what I wanted to say about parenting, I had said in the Atlantic story. So I said, I'm really interested in what's happening with the adults. And they said, oh, you want to write a happiness book? and I said, no, I don't want to write a happiness book. But it ended up being that I was supposed to be writing a happiness book. And the happiness book was making me miserable. The irony was that I used to call it the miserable depression-inducing happiness book, because I was starting out as a therapist, and I really felt like what I got the privilege of seeing every day was something much richer and deeper and nuanced. And I think that you start to realize that happiness as a byproduct of living our lives in a meaningful way is what I think we all want. But happiness as the means itself is kind of a recipe for disaster. And I felt like I just wanted to bring people into the therapy room to give them a sense of what we don't get to see normally when we go through our lives, when we have our masks on, when we're looking at social media. And so that's what I did. That's how the book came about.
Great. Now, I would think that as a therapist, looking for a therapist has got to be a particular journey. And of course, you get several names and you arrive at your choice in a smart way. But when you introduce your therapist, I know I first said, oh boy, this is going to be interesting. What would you tell people to look for in a therapist? Because people don't always work well with one or the other, you know. Yeah,
that's so true. You know, it's not like going to a cardiologist that you might see once a year or, you know, for 20 minutes. This is someone that you're going to see weekly for 50 minutes on a regular basis. And the relationship with your therapist matters so much more. In fact, study after study shows that the most important factor in the successful outcome of people's therapy is the relationship with the therapist, that it matters more than the person's number of years of experience, the modality they use, the kind of training that they had, all of which matter. Don't get me wrong, they all matter, but they don't matter as much as that one factor. So I think that what people imagine is that they're going to get the name of a therapist, they're going to go into the office, and they're either going to say, okay, I'm going to continue, and that's my therapist, or they're going to feel like, yeah, I don't really want to do this, and they'll leave. It's not like that. It's really a consultation when you go in. It's like a first date, and you want to see, how did I feel in the room with this person? Just what was did I feel understood? Did I feel like the person kind of got it? And if so, go back for a second session, right? And that doesn't mean you're in therapy with that person yet. It will take a little while before you kind of really settle in and say, yes, this is the person I'm going to work with. And if you're not feeling like it's a good match, what you should do is say to the therapist, I don't feel like this is a good match. I'm not sure what's going on. And maybe you'll discover something about yourself. Maybe that's a pattern that you have, or maybe you realize you guys just don't click, and maybe that therapist can help you get to the right person. So matching with your therapist is really important to really pay attention to. It's not just going to therapy, but are you in therapy with the right match?
Wendell is a little quirky. In a way. So I guess that's, but how do you even know if you need therapy? You arrived at that point. There was a presenting situation, as you say in the book. If you could tell us just a little bit, because we don't want to give away a lot of the book, what brought you to his sofa?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I like what you were saying about, what brings people to therapy, because I think that what happens is we treat our emotional health differently from the way that we treat our physical health. So if maybe we're feeling some discomfort in our bodies, right, whatever it is, we will go get it checked out with our physician probably before, let's say you have some chest pain, you'll get it checked out before you have a massive coronary. But it usually, that's your first thing. It's like, I'm not just going to let this go. But if you feel some discomfort emotionally, if something feels off emotionally, usually people don't go get it checked out. They wait until it gets really bad, when they're having sort of the equivalent of an emotional heart attack. And that's when they land in a therapist's office. And the sad thing about that is that, first of all, you've suffered unnecessarily for a certain amount of time that you didn't need to. And secondly, it's harder to treat when you wait that long. It's like we don't practice preventative medicine for our emotional health, and we should. So that's one thing. The other thing is the presenting problem, which I write about in the book. The thing that somebody comes in with is often, I always say that I'm listening for the music under the lyrics. The lyrics are, here's what's going on in my job, my marriage, with my child, with, my parent, with whatever is going on, right? But the music under the lyrics is, what is the underlying struggle or pattern that got the person into this situation in the first place? And so usually there's something very concrete that brings them in, but there's maybe something bigger to look at that will help them in the longer term, not just with this one problem, but to navigate more smoothly through life more generally.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you say is don't Google your therapist. And I know most of us, if we're curious about somebody, that's the first thing we do. Why not? Why not Google your therapist? Why not find out?
Yeah, so I'm not saying, right, I'm not saying don't Google your therapist. I'm saying that I think what happens is, you want to know sort of like, why do I want this information? And in my case, I did Google my therapist, and I went down sort of the internet rabbit hole, right? Where and I have a background as a journalist, so I really went down the internet rabbit hole and used my journalistic skills. I didn't find anything, terribly surprising about him. One thing though that did happen, and here's sort of the downside of it, was that I had been talking in therapy about my very close relationship with my aging father, who had congestive heart failure, and I didn't know how much longer he had. And I was so glad that I had this time to say goodbye to him and to have all the conversations that we wanted to have with each other. And I'd been talking a lot about my father and that relationship in therapy. And then when I Googled my therapist, or I should say Google stalked my therapist, because it was not just a cursory Google, I found out that his father, per the obituary I found, had died at a relatively young age, and he had been a marathon runner, and he just dropped dead one day. And so all of a sudden I became very self-conscious about the fact that I wondered what it was like for my therapist to hear me come in every week and talk about all this time that I had with my father, to have these conversations, to have this close relationship at my father's advanced age. And so I started editing myself, because I was worried that I would make him uncomfortable by talking about it. And finally, of course, I confessed to the fact that I Googled him. And once we talked about it, we had this really beautiful conversation about fathers and mine. And I'm really glad that I was honest. But I think a lot of people do that. I know that people Google me because they inevitably slip up. You know, they'll say things like, you know, well, you grew up in Los Angeles, but how would they know where I grew up if they didn't read about me? Or somebody had said like, oh, Stanford, the Harvard of the West, you know, and I never said that I'd gone to Stanford. They Googled that. So, you know, I think that we feel like we have a lot of information, and then it becomes sort of the elephant in the room when people don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also write about kind of the concept of self-understanding as treatment. And I think that whether you're in treatment or not, knowing yourself is so important. How does therapy play in that? And what is the role of the therapist in kind of leading the person to that understanding, to that spot?
Yeah, well, I think that we all have blind spots, and I think that's where we get stuck, and that's where a lot of the difficulties come up in our lives. It's the parts of us that we can't see. And I talk in the book about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. So idiot compassion is what our friends do. So our friends say, you know, here's what happened with my partner, my boss, my sibling, my best friend, whatever. And we say, yeah, you're right. They were wrong. They never should have done that, right? So we always take our friend's side. That's idiot compassion. We think that's being supportive. And it's kind of like, sometimes even with our friends, we've seen that they're telling the same story over and over, and maybe they have a role in this. It's kind of like if a fight breaks out in every bar you're going to, maybe it's you. But we don't say that to our friends because we're offering idiot compassion. Wise compassion is what a therapist will do. A therapist will hold up a mirror to you and help you to see yourself in a way that maybe you haven't been willing or able to do. And so a lot of people come to therapy and they say, I want something to change. I'm not happy. And usually what they want to change is someone else or something else. And what therapy does is it helps you to have agency. It helps you to see what changes you can make and what role you have in whatever's not working. And that's not to say that there aren't difficult circumstances or certainly difficult people out there. I remember when I was training, one of my mentors said, before diagnosing someone with depression, make sure they aren't surrounded by assholes, right? So yes, there are difficult people out there, but then what is our response to that person? A, do we need to be in relationship with that person? And B, if we want to, then what is our role in perpetuating the difficulty in the relationship? Because we do have a role in it in terms of how we respond. So I think that therapy can do lots of things to help you to see something about the way that you move through the world. And just one last thing is on that question is, in my TED Talk, which is sort of like a mini version of the book, I talk about how we're all unreliable narrators and how we all come in with a story, but sometimes who the heroes and villains are is a little mixed up, who are the supporting characters and who are the main characters, the things we leave in, the things we leave out, the parts we emphasize or minimize. Therapy is a process of kind of rewriting that faulty narrative. And it's a process of, yes, getting to know yourself, but it's also a process of unknowing yourself, to let go of those limiting stories that you've been telling yourself about yourself and that are running in the background and getting in your way. So there's a knowing, there's a getting to know yourself part of therapy, and there's a getting to unknow some of this stuff that maybe is part of this faulty narrative.
That actually leads me to a question I was going to ask a little later on. There are several lines that in the book that I just absolutely loved. One of them was, people want to be understood and to understand. which I thought was a great line for the times we're living in particular, as we all seek to understand what's going on around us. Is that the mark of a good relationship, be it with a spouse, a parent, a friend, that we understand where they're coming from? It doesn't mean you agree with them, but that you understand why they think that way and that they understand you. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
So that's what I see a lot with couples in my practice is I think what people want to hear, the 3 words they want to hear more than I love you is I understand you. So you can say you love someone, but if you feel, but if that person feels misunderstood by you, it doesn't really matter that you love them. It matters to some degree, but if you know, an act of a loving act is to be able to say, I want to understand you. That is the verb to love, right? Mm-hmm. Is I am going to try to understand you, even if I don't agree with you or I have a different perspective. So a lot of times when I see couples, you know, the big complaint is you don't understand me. And that's because sometimes when we are trying to listen to people, we're listening again, when we talk about the music and the lyrics, we're listening to the lyrics, we're listening to the content. But to be a really good listener and to really understand somebody, you need to listen to what is the bigger, what is the bigger kind of issue that's surrounding what they're saying. So like in the case of COVID, for example, right now, I see a lot of couples and one person, you know, they'll disagree about how much, you know, like what are the guidelines and how much they should be around other people or not around other people, or where it's safe to go or not safe to go. And sometimes people get really backed against the wall in their respective positions because they're not understanding why the other person feels the way they do. They're just hearing, I want to go to this thing. And the other person says, well, absolutely not. You don't care about the rest of the family's health. As opposed to, why is this so important to you? And then if you can hear what the other person says and why this matters to them, and then if you can then argue their position for them, you don't have to agree with their position, but just trying that exercise of, I'm going to argue your position for you, you have so much more empathy and there's so much more understanding. And then both people have so much less rigidity as they have a conversation about how they want to resolve the issue at hand.
Mm-hmm. Now you have 4 patients in the book, and they're composites. And all of them, I think, are hilarious and sad but I think there's one patient in particular, at least for me, Julie, that really touched my heart. And tell us a little bit about her situation and what you learned from her. You know, that was kind of very much a two-way street, and really what we can all learn from her situation.
Julie was this young woman who went on her honeymoon, came back, felt something in her breast, thought maybe she was pregnant because she and her new husband had been together for a long time and they wanted to start a family soon after getting married. And it was not a pregnancy, it was cancer. And she was told that she had this very treatable form of cancer. And so she really came to me, not because she thought she was going to die, because all of her physicians said, you're going to be fine. We're just, you know, you're going to have to go through this treatment. And, you know, this is not something that you have to think about in terms of mortality. And so she really just wanted help with managing being newly married and going through cancer treatment and, you know, having this big life event happen. And so she came to me for that. She went through the treatment and then she said goodbye. And then 6 months later, I get a voicemail from her. She wants to come back in. And it turns out that she was going to do her sign-off scan so that she could get pregnant. And on that scan, they found a different cancer. It was a very rare, aggressive form of cancer. And it was going to kill her. And she didn't know, or the doctors didn't know, whether she had a year or 10 years, which of course the space between a year and 10 years is enormous. And how was she going to choose to live her life? And the thing about working with Julie was, first of all, I told her up front that I did not have experience working with somebody like her. And I suggested that maybe she go to somebody who did oncological therapy in a way that maybe, you know, she was going to get one shot at this and I didn't want to mess it up for her. And she said, no, the reason I want to come to you is because I don't want to be part of the whole sort of cancer team part of this. She wasn't a person for whom the pink ribbons and the affirmations and the optimism, that was not her style. And so she wanted to go through it with me, who was not sort of in that world. And I think I learned as much from her as maybe she learned from me. We went through this experience. Obviously, her journey was different from mine. But what I really took away from it was that what she did was, and, you know, she wasn't, I think a lot of people paint cancer patients as sort of saints, you know, like she's amazing. She was very real. She was, you know, she would rage at the situation. She would have disagreements with her husband. She would, you know, do all kinds of things. But what she did do that was really, I think, important for all of us to think about is she lived her life with intentionality every day because she didn't know how many days she was going to have. And I think that, and she made choices that a lot of people thought were a little bit crazy, as you remember from the book, but that were really choices that I think were inspiring, because a lot of times we are too afraid to act on our dreams. We are too afraid to say, I'm going to take this risk. And as Julie said, what are we waiting for? Do you really need a terminal diagnosis to do the things in life that you want to do? And so when I thought about, you know, going to see Julie, people would say, oh, isn't it depressing seeing this person? And I liked her so much, right? So it was even harder. Isn't it depressing going into these sessions? I said, no, actually, there's so much vitality in these sessions. There's so much life in these sessions, more so than I think the rest of us who don't realize that life has 100% mortality rate, and that doesn't just apply to other people. And so I think if you can keep the awareness of death sitting on one shoulder, not in a morbid way, but in a way that energizes you, that helps you to say, I have a limited time on this planet. How do I want to live today? Who are the people that are important to me? Who are the people that maybe I don't need to spend so much emotional real estate on, right? And really being intentional. I think COVID has done that a little bit for us too, where I think the stripping back, the stripping down, and saying, what are my priorities? That's what that did for Julie. And I think it's I think when people read the book, so many people have said that reading about that experience with Julie and feeling like they really got to know her made them examine their own lives much more closely.
And I think with the idea of COVID, we, at least for me, but also with friends that I've spoken, we realize what we really value is what we miss. And we realize that there are things we miss. A lot of it is the social aspect, you know, and maybe living our life moving forward that might help. Now, early on in the book, you write that there can be no gain without loss. And this is both public and personal. And even in the there was a New York Times piece of yours that I read called "The Toilet is the New Couch," which I thought was hilarious. And you wrote, and I'm going to quote, "I'm being exposed to a toxic daily dose of devastating stories of anxiety and loss of every conceivable kind. Loss of loved ones, loss of health, loss of jobs, loss of stability, loss of physical presence, loss of touch, loss of daily routines, loss of weddings and graduations and holiday gatherings, and loss of even the ability to smile at neighbors while walking around the block because our mouths are covered. And in some ways, the losses can be boiled down to this: loss of everything that makes us human." So this leads me to two questions. First, before we get into the laughter, how do we deal with this loss that all of us are feeling to a certain degree with this pandemic? I have not been able to hug any grandchild in months. We've not been able to get together with friends, you know, all kinds of losses. How do we deal with this now in the moment?
Yeah. So the piece that you were talking about, I was writing about sort of the both and the laughter, and we'll talk about that in a second. But there was another piece I wrote for the New York Times around that time about the grief and the loss. And what I was saying in that piece was that I think that a lot of us don't acknowledge our losses because we feel like there's almost a hierarchy of grief. That if it's not loss of life, loss of health, loss of income, that our losses don't matter as much, or we feel guilty even talking about them because we have a roof over our head and food on the table and we don't have COVID, right? And so what I said is, it's not the grief Olympics. That if you don't feel your losses, if you don't acknowledge them, they will come out in other ways. If we don't feel our feelings, they come out in maybe, you know, you're more short-tempered in your relationships. You're having trouble sleeping. You're feeling, it comes out with like too much food or too much wine or too much mindless internet. A colleague of mine said that the internet was the most effective short-term non-prescription painkiller out there. And I agree with that. You can mindlessly go, you know, on the internet so that you don't have to feel. And so what happens is, just because you try to numb your feelings, it doesn't mean they go away. Numbness isn't the absence of feelings. It's a state of being overwhelmed by too many feelings. So you're not actually numb. You think you are. And so right now, when people are experiencing all of this, you know, whatever reaction they uniquely are having to COVID, right? So we're having kind of a collective stressor, and then everybody has their own unique reaction to it. And some people minimize their reaction to it because they feel like they're comparing it to somebody else's suffering. And you don't need to do that. It's really important that everybody acknowledges how this is affecting them, because it will come out in lots of ways. And even if it's not coming out now, it will come out later in some kind of post-traumatic way. So that's point number one. And then point number two was about the piece that you were reading from, was about that I was talking about, we were stripped of a lot of the things that make us feel human, but not everything. And so I was talking about how a lot of my patients during COVID, because I've been doing remote sessions, need to find a private place to talk to their therapist. And so sometimes they go out to their car, or sometimes they go in their closet. Often it's in the bathroom, and they're sitting on a toilet with the toilet seat down. And this one woman was talking to me about her mother was in a nursing home, and they had a confirmed case of COVID, and she was very worried that her mother was going to get COVID and die. She's sobbing, and she was sitting on the toilet, and she leaned back and accidentally flushed the toilet. And this big like sound filled, right, the space between us. And it was really funny, but I didn't laugh, of course, because of what she was talking about. And then, you know, she said to me, "Am I the only person who does therapy on the toilet?" And I said, "No, the toilet has become the new couch." And I didn't mean that glibly. It just came out, but I immediately regretted it, because I thought, this is really not good timing for that. And she laughed, and then I laughed. And at the end of the session, she said to me, "You know, everything you said today really helped me, but what helped me the most was laughing together." We were laughing for quite a while together. And she said, "It reminded me of who I was before COVID, and it reminds me of who I can be again when we emerge from this." And it was just something that I think that we feel like we can't experience joy, we can't laugh, we can't enjoy the fact that we don't have to commute to work anymore right now, or that we can spend time reading a book, or we can have a longer FaceTime conversation with our friend, and we can catch up, and normally we don't have time to do that. Or in my case, my son was home doing remote learning, and of course if I could snap my fingers and make COVID go away, I would. But the fact that I get to see my teenager more and talk to him more, I really like that. And so I think there are these silver linings that we're afraid to talk about. And so that's the both and of the situation, that, you know, it's horrible that there's this pandemic going on, and there are some things that we are appreciating about our lives that we can take with us as we emerge from this as well. So it's really important, I think, in any situation to look at the both and not just one aspect of it or another.
Yeah, I know for me, just receiving some messages and videos and memes from friends that have just made me laugh out loud that I haven't probably in a long time. So it's, you know, kind of this release. There's another patient, Rita, who also you reflect on, and in her case, we're left to wonder a lot of things, and it might be appropriate for this crowd too. Is it ever too late to redeem yourself? At what age are we too old to, you know, think what we might have been? Or how old are we where we have to accept who we are and give up on change? And I think that's an important question as we move into our 50s, 60s, and in cases, our 70s.
Yeah, so that's why I loved Rita's story and wanted to include it. And I think that it was really interesting in when I was choosing who was going to go in the book. And of course I have permissions and all of that and talked about it at the beginning of the book. But, you know, you have everything from somebody in her 20s who keeps, you know, dating the wrong guys and can't understand why she can't find the right guy. And there's this pattern she's not aware of. And she has her whole future ahead of her. And then you have Rita, who comes to me right before she's about to turn 70 and is utterly alone in the world. Her marriages did not work. Her adult children are estranged from her because of choices that she made as a parent that she regrets greatly, and also had reasons for. And she says if things don't change, she's not sure if her life is worth living. And you see that she makes tremendous change. And I don't want to sort of give away what happens to her, but I think that what she shows is that change can happen at any age when you are ready. You have to be ready. When people first come into me, not only am I listening for what is not working in their lives, but I'm scanning for strengths. And I want to know what made them come in to see me. Why this week, this year, this month did they come in when maybe the problem has been going on, like in Rita's case, for decades. So there's a strength there. They're willing to say, I need something to change. I'm willing to do the work. Maybe they don't know how much work they've signed up for yet, but they know that they're ready to do something proactive to change their lives. I think that the question with Rita is a question that's very universal, which was, what do we do with regret? What do we do with things we can't change? How do we live with the things that we really wish had not happened or that we hadn't done, or the things that we wish we had done and didn't? We all have those experiences. And then with her kids, it was this question of, she had so wanted her kids to forgive her. And she wanted to have a relationship with her kids who were very, very angry with her for various reasons. And what I talked to her about was this notion of forced forgiveness, that you can't, you know, you can't force forgiveness. And I think so many people think on the other side, like on the kids' side, they feel guilty that, well, I should forgive my parent or I should forgive this person. You don't have to forgive anybody. People think that, excuse me, if you forgive somebody that you will feel lighter, you will feel better sometimes, but sometimes it feels inauthentic and you feel worse. And so I talked about this notion of the difference between, you can have compassion for somebody without forgiving them. So her kids could have compassion for maybe what she went through and still not forgive her for the significant, you know, things that happened in their childhoods that still make them very upset. And so once she let go of the notion that she wanted her kids to forgive her, and once she realized, I need to be the mother to them now that I wasn't then. How can I do that and really pay attention to their needs and not my own needs? My own need is I want them to forgive me because that will absolve me and make me feel better. But really what her real need was, I want to have a relationship with my kids. How do you have a relationship with your kids? You stop trying to get them to do something that will make you feel better. And you say, how can I be the best mother possible to them now? What are their needs now? And maybe that will draw them closer in a different way. And you can see that with 3 of the 4, that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Then one final question before we open up. In one segment of the book, you write about the speed of want, which I love, and how it has influenced so many parts of our lives. What do you mean by this? And how does it interfere with how we run our lives, even what we expect from therapy, but really how we want our lives? We are now in this instantaneous society, and we're kind of bothered by the fact that we can't do things right away or get what we want right away.
Yeah, so I write about that. There's a chapter in the book called The Speed of Want, and I write about this shift that we're experiencing, which is, I think that, you know, we want instant gratification. We want things to happen very quickly, and we're used to it because everything goes at the speed of the internet. You know, we're not used to waiting for anything. Anything we want to do is sort of, you know, you can click something on your phone and food will show up at your door in 20 minutes. You know, we don't really have the experience of patience. And I think what happens is we miss out on what happens when we slow down. And so the speed of want, that phrase came from when I was doing my internship, and some of the other interns and I were sitting around calculating our hours and how many hours we had to do and how many patients we had to see in order to sit for our boards, and then when we would take our boards and when we would get licensed and all of that. And one of our supervisors happened to be walking by, and she said, nobody, you know, the speed of light is outdated. Today everybody operates at the speed of want. And she said, you know, what does it matter? Because we were saying I'll be this age and this age and this age when all these different milestones happen. She said, what does it matter what age you are when it happens? It's still going to happen. It doesn't matter. Like, pay attention to the experience. And I think we see that when people come to therapy, right? Where, you know, I think some people will say, I have to make this decision about something. I need to make it in a month. Can you help me do that? You know, one person was saying, you know, I have my girlfriend's going to leave me if I don't propose to her by Valentine's Day. It was like around the holidays. I need to figure this out before Valentine's Day. Can you guarantee that I'll have an answer? I said, of course I can't guarantee that. So this person ended up going to like a life coach who could guarantee that. I don't know what happened with the person, but I feel like, you know, maybe that person would have that answer by Valentine's Day, but maybe the person wouldn't. And so I think that we need to let life unfold in a more organic way, because it will be a richer experience for us.
Yeah. And that's hard to do, because I understand the speed of want. Now I'm going to open up. I'll look to see if Stephanie has opened, and we will get to, okay, we have from Terry. Any idea when your book will be on TV? And what is Eva Longoria like as an executive producer?
You know, with COVID, things have gotten a little slowed down, but I don't know when it will be on, but I do know that that one thing that's really important to me about this show, and I hope that you will find this as well when you see it, is that I wanted it to be a show about people who happen to be therapists, as opposed to a show about therapists. And that distinction is really important, because this is a book about the human condition, and it's a show about the human condition. And so I think all of the tropes in the media about therapists are so outdated, and there's so many misconceptions about what this process is. And so I hope that this will be the show that changes all of that.
Well, this is great, because one of our listeners says, how do you diplomatically suggest to a friend that she should consider seeking therapy? And what website is reliable for seeking a qualified therapist?
Mm-hmm. So I think the thing about suggesting to someone that they see someone is that you don't want them to feel pathologized. You don't want them to feel like you're saying something is wrong with them. And that has to do with the stigma in our culture. Like if you said to someone, I noticed that you feel a lot of abdominal discomfort after you eat. Why don't you go see a gastroenterologist? No one would say, are you saying something's wrong with me? Right. So, people would just say, oh, you're right. Let me go see a gastroenterologist because something is not right with my stomach when I'm eating. But if you say to someone, I noticed that you're struggling a lot, and I noticed you've been talking to me about all of these things, maybe you should go see someone. Sometimes people are offended by that. So again, there's that sort of cultural piece around it. I think if you've been to therapy and you've had a good experience with it, that's a good place to start, which is to say, I love you and I care about you and I don't want to see you struggle so much. And I see that this keeps coming up for you. And I want to tell you a little bit about when I was struggling and I went to therapy and it really helped me to understand some things. Maybe that would be helpful for you too. What do you think about trying one session and seeing what it's like? Right. Mm-hmm. And again, making it about sort of like going in and just for a consultation makes it feel a lot more doable to people than thinking they're going to go to therapy, because all of a sudden they get very anxious about, well, what is this going to be and what kind of time commitment, financial commitment, et cetera, is this going to be, as opposed to, why don't you just go talk to somebody, have a consultation. Even if you don't go back, you might get some ideas or tools about how to cope with the situation better.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's another question. After finishing the book, what did you realize about yourself that wasn't apparent while writing it? Which is true of any kind of writing project. You begin one way and then you end somewhere else and learn something along the way.
So unlike the parenting book or the happiness book that I didn't write, this book came extremely easily to me in the sense of it was a book that I really had wanted to write and felt like I needed to write. And you know, for me, I think in the first draft, so you have to realize that when I decided to write this book, everyone said, "Oh, nobody's going to read that book." So, you know, everyone wanted to read supposedly the parenting book and the happiness book, but no one was going to want to read this book that I really felt like I needed to write. So I was very unvarnished in this book. I was very raw and authentic, and I kind of just let it rip. And I don't mean in a creepy way. I mean, just, I felt like I needed to be as vulnerable in the book as my patients were. And so when I turned it into my publisher, and, you know, I thought maybe like 3 people would read this book because that's what people were saying. And then all of a sudden, everybody started passing it around. And then they were saying, you know, I was laughing, I was crying, I saw myself, I saw everybody I know in this book. And I thought, well, maybe 300 people will read it or 3,000 people will read it. And maybe I should clean myself up a little bit. And I'm really glad that I didn't, because I think that the reason that so many people are reading the book and responding to the book and seeing themselves in the book is because I did not clean myself up. And so when you talk about the writing process, I think I wasn't so much in my head. I wasn't so much worried about the writing process. I was much more interested in bringing people into an experience and hoping that they would have an emotional experience reading the book that would help them to see themselves in a different way by the end of the book. I think if I saw anything new in the writing process, it was about how all of the chapters are interconnected. I think that every chapter is in conversation with the chapter before it and the chapter after it, and how all of the stories are really interwoven quite organically.
Mm-hmm. And it is, I can attest to that. It is very personal, almost in a way that I just had to at some points, because you're really vulnerable. And I think when people become vulnerable, you can empathize in a way. You, like you said, you do see yourself in them. Here's another question. In my family, men are much more reluctant than women to engage in therapy. Do you find this is true, and what do you think is the reason? And I think that's true not only of men, but in certain cultures, therapy is not something that's acceptable.
Yeah. So yeah, the cultural piece in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of socioeconomic status, you know, therapy is looked at very differently from different, you know, whoever you're surrounded by, right? And so there are people for whom, if they came to therapy, the people in their families would, you know, say, well, why are you talking to somebody else about our business? We don't do that in our culture, right? So with men and women, which was the question that was asked, I do see a difference. And I think, you know, the difference is sort of like this. So men will come in and they will say something like, at some point in the therapy, they will say, so I've never told anyone this before. And then I sit back and I wait for what they're about to say. And then what they tell me feels so mild, right? It feels like, wow, even if they have a great marriage and they have great friends and great family, they really felt like in our culture, you can't be vulnerable really in any way. That's sort of the message that men are getting. And women will come in and they'll also at times say, you know, hey, I've never told anyone this before. But then they'll say, except for my mother, my sister, and my best friend, right? So they've told maybe 1 to 3 people. So it's not like they haven't told anyone, but to them, it feels like they haven't told anyone because they've only been able to tell these, you know, maybe their sister, maybe their mother, maybe their best friend. And so they feel a lot of shame around whatever that thing is. And usually it is something that goes maybe deeper at first. And so I think that has to do with the messaging in our culture. So when I see couples, and let's say I'm seeing a heterosexual couple, and the woman says to the man, you know, I really want to get to know you. I really want to understand what's going on inside of you. I really want you to share your inner experience with me. And so then he does. And let's say that he starts crying. All of a sudden, she looks at me like deer in headlights. She does not know what to do with his tears. And she's profoundly uncomfortable. And she will say something later about how she felt unsafe. And so here's the thing. She wants to feel safe by feeling closer to her husband. And yet she feels unsafe when he falls apart, right? And so what do we do with those mixed messages? So why do fewer men come to therapy? Maybe because they're given different messages around what's acceptable than women are.
Well, look what happens to John. How long it takes him to really reveal this.
Well, right. Right. And in John's case, you know, he felt like he had to be, John is somebody that the first person that you meet in the book, and he's having sort of trouble in his marriage and trouble sleeping and trouble with, you know, lots of people in his life. And he has so much pain underneath it all that he cannot talk about. And I think that, you know, what happens is he comes across as very sort of obnoxious and narcissistic. And that's because our behaviors are how we speak the unspeakable. When we feel like we can't say something with words, they come out through the ways that we act. And his whole thing was, I need to keep people at a distance from me, because if they get close to me, they'll see my pain. Mm-hmm. So I think with John, what happened was you saw that there were ways that he felt like he had to be the rock, you know, as the man in the family, felt like he had to be the rock for the tragedy that had happened. I don't want to sort of reveal what it was, but that had happened in his family. And that if he broke down, the whole family would fall apart. So I think men often feel that pressure.
It's almost this armor he's built around himself to put people off.
Yeah. And also, again, feeling like his role had to be the strong one.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
And I'm sorry, I'm noticing that. So I have a hard out at the hour because I have another one of these to do. And so I'm noticing the time. So maybe, I think we have time for
one more question. And I guess this one will be, one of our listeners is curious about it, patients' reactions to your book. Even though this is a composite, your patients are really a composite. But what have been, have you heard?
Yeah. So, I mean, the patients who are in the book, of course, you know, gave me permission, and it's been really interesting because on the one hand, they knew when we were going through treatment. I didn't write about anybody that I was currently seeing, I should say also. So these were people that, you know, I couldn't do the work and write about them at the same time. You know, I think that they knew that I had cared about them, but they didn't really know. I think that in the book, they really felt my love in an even deeper way. And I think they were very moved by how I wrote about my relationships with them. So, and I think with my current patients, you know, some people have read the book, some people have not read the book, but I think what it does do is if we do talk about the book, if they bring it up, it really gives them permission to talk about our relationship on a deeper level, because I write so much in the book about that relationship and how transformative the relationship with the therapist is.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Lori. Thank you. Again, you can buy the book at Books and Books, support our local indie. And thank you so much for joining. I hope you all had, I was fascinated by the book. And as I said, I laughed out loud many times and then got a little teary too. But thank you all for joining us. And I'm not sure if one of our other hosts from one of our other J's.
I'd like to say thank you from the Miami Beach JCC. Everyone wants to go through, but thank you all for coming this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again on July 9th with Linda Leugman.
And as Anna pointed out, we just want to say, please support our local independent booksellers in Orlando. Please support the Writer's Block bookstore. And down here in South Florida, we're asking you to buy the book at Books and Books. So thank you all for coming. We appreciate you being here and cannot wait to see you at the next one. Have a great day.
And if anyone needs the recording, if anyone wants the recording to this to share with people who couldn't make it, send me an email. I had put it in the chat, stephanie.o@levisjcc.org, and we'll send you the recording. So thank you all. Marcy, you're muted. Marcy, if you want to unmute yourself.
I wanted to thank our speakers, Anna and Lori, for the fabulous insights into mental health. We really appreciate your time and effort. It was just a wonderful afternoon. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you much. Thank you.